The knock on my door that morning sounded more like a declaration of war than a polite greeting. When I opened it, there she was, Margaret, the HOA president, standing on my porch in her pastel blazer like she was auditioning for a reality show about tyrants. In one hand she held a clipboard, in the other, a coffee mug that said, "Because I'm the boss." She smiled that fake, neighborly smile people use right before doing something horrible. Behind her stood her son, Chase, a 20-something with designer sunglasses, flip-flops, and the confidence of someone who's never paid for anything in his life. Before I could even say good morning, Margaret announced, "We're here to discuss the transfer of the lake house to Chase." I laughed, thinking it was a joke. But she didn't laugh back. That's when I realized she wasn't kidding. She actually believed my lake house belonged to her spoiled son. It started 2 months earlier when the HOA voted to reclassify several properties around the lake for community alignment. At the time, it sounded like bureaucratic nonsense, words that meant nothing to me. My lake house had been in my family for 20 years, and I paid every tax, permit, and fee on time. The property line was clear as day, the deed clean, the paperwork airtight. But Margaret had a different interpretation of reality. She ran the HOA like a royal court, where rules bent to her will and logic had no citizenship. Everyone in our small lakeside neighborhood feared her wrath: late fees for unmowed lawns, fines for decorative flags, even warnings for overly festive Christmas lights. So when she came to me with that smug little smirk, claiming the board had reassigned my property to her son for youth development purposes, it was equal parts ridiculous and infuriating. At first, I thought she must have misunderstood something. I asked calmly, "Margaret, are you sure you're not confusing addresses? Because this house, my house, has been in my name for decades." She handed me a folder with a printed letter bearing the HOA seal and a blurry photocopy of a supposed reallocation notice. The language was bureaucratic gibberish, clearly written to sound official while meaning nothing. Chase leaned against the porch railing, scrolling through his phone and muttering, "Mom said I could move in by next week." I blinked at him. "Move in? You're not moving anywhere near this house." Margaret's smile stiffened. "Oh, you'll see, dear. It's already been approved." She tapped the paper like it was divine scripture and strutted off, her son following behind, leaving the faint smell of expensive cologne and cheap arrogance. That night, I sat in my kitchen staring at the so-called reallocation notice under the light of my dining lamp. The HOA seal was printed in black and white, not the color version used for official letters. The signature looked like it was copied and pasted. But what really made my stomach twist was the date. It was dated a week before the reclassification meeting had even happened. Margaret wasn't just bending rules, she was forging them. I decided to go over to the HOA office the next morning to demand answers. The office was in the community clubhouse, a bland building with motivational posters about teamwork and a perpetually broken coffee machine. Margaret sat behind the desk, typing something furiously on her computer while pretending not to see me. When I placed the forged document in front of her, she looked up with a condescending tilt of her head and said, "Oh, that's just a preliminary draft. The finalized one should be arriving soon." I told her she couldn't just hand over someone's house because she felt like it. She leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. Technically, the HOA reserves the right to redistribute certain properties if they're deemed underutilized. Underutilized? I nearly laughed in disbelief. "Margaret, it's my vacation home, not a public restroom." She smiled again, that politician's grin, and said, "Well, perhaps you can appeal it at the next board meeting." Then she waved her hand like I was dismissed from an audience with the Queen. That's when I realized Margaret wasn't operating within rules or reason. She was drunk on power. To her, HOA authority wasn't about maintaining lawns or collecting dues. It was a crown she wore proudly. And her son was her little prince, destined to inherit whatever she could snatch. I called my friend Tony that afternoon, a lawyer who specialized in property law. After reading the document, he confirmed what I already suspected. This is fake. She has no legal grounds. None. But she's trying to intimidate you into giving up. I laughed bitterly. She picked the wrong guy. 2 days later, the situation escalated from absurd to surreal. I returned home from work to find Chase lounging on my front porch in a folding chair, sipping from a soda can, and playing music loudly on his phone. His car, a shiny blue convertible, was parked diagonally across my driveway. "Hey bro," he greeted, as if we were roommates. "Mom said I could start moving some stuff in. Gotta claim my space, you know?" I told him to get off my property before I called the police. He chuckled. "You might want to check with the HOA first, dude." His smug tone made my hands shake, but I kept calm. I walked back inside and started taking photos. His car, the porch, even his face. Evidence. I wasn't going to fight Margaret with anger. I was going to fight her with paperwork. Later that night, I heard laughter coming from outside. Chase had invited friends over, and they were roasting marshmallows on the edge of my dock, as if it were their private hangout. My patience snapped. I walked down to the lake, flashlight in hand, and told them to leave. One of his friends laughed. He thinks he still owns the place. The others joined in. Chase smirked. "Relax, old man. We're just chilling. You should be happy your property's finally getting some use." I wanted to shout, but I didn't. Instead, I turned around, went back inside, and wrote down everything that happened, every word, every insult, every detail. I had a feeling I'd need it soon. The next morning, I called Tony again. "You're not gonna believe this," I said. "They've basically moved in." He sighed. "Do not touch them, do not remove anything, and don't confront them again. Just document everything. Let's make this illegal." Ambush. It was tempting to throw Chase's lawn chair into the lake, but Tony was right. Revenge was better served in paperwork. Over the next few days, I noticed something strange. Neighbors began avoiding me. The friendly waves stopped. One even muttered, "Sorry about the transfer," as I passed. The rumor had spread. Margaret was telling everyone I'd agreed to donate the lake house to her son for community benefit. That woman had turned my life into a PR campaign. Flyers even appeared on the community bulletin board reading "Lake House Transition in Progress. HOA Youth Initiative led by Chase Harlow." My name wasn't even mentioned. I tore one down, crumpled it in my fist, and realized just how far she was willing to go. That night, as the sun set over the water, I sat on my porch staring across the lake at the reflection of my own house, now claimed by strangers. Margaret and her son were sitting on my dock, laughing, toasting with sparkling water like they'd won something. I felt a mix of rage and calm clarity. They thought they could bully me out of my home. They thought paperwork and manipulation could rewrite reality. But they had no idea that I wasn't just fighting to keep a house. I was about to make sure they'd regret ever stepping on my porch. And as the crickets started singing and the water shimmered under the moonlight, I whispered to myself, "If they think they can take it, wait till they see how it feels when I sell it right out from under them." The following morning I woke up to the sound of a delivery truck pulling away from the lake house driveway, and when I stepped outside I saw a large wooden crate stamped with the HOA logo sitting right beside my porch. There was a note taped on top written in Margaret's unmistakably perfect cursive that read, "Appliances for Community Property Improvement." Inside were brand new patio chairs, a barbecue grill, and even a jet ski still wrapped in plastic. It hit me then that she wasn't just pretending to own my house anymore, she was investing in it. Her plan wasn't intimidation anymore, it was occupation. Chase stood nearby giving instructions to the delivery guys like some kind of spoiled property manager while filming everything on his phone. He winked at me and said, "Gotta make content for the HOA youth program, man. Mom says this lake house is going to be our social media centerpiece." I wanted to snatch the phone from his hand, but I knew Tony was right. I needed proof, not violence. I took out my own phone, filmed him back, and said calmly, Thanks for confirming your trespassing on camera. His smirk faltered for a second before he laughed and muttered something about lawyers. That afternoon I drove straight to the county records office to get copies of my deed, tax receipts, and any HOA correspondence filed over the last year. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with reading glasses, looked over the request and frowned. "Oh, you're the one with the lake house," she said. "There's been a lot of activity on that parcel lately." My stomach dropped. She pulled up a file on her screen and turned the monitor toward me. Someone had submitted a property use adjustment form, signed by both me and Margaret, except I'd never signed it. The signature was a shaky copy of mine, good enough to fool an untrained eye but sloppy enough to enrage me. The clerk said the document had been filed 3 weeks ago. "Can I get a copy of this?" I asked through clenched teeth. "Of course," she said. "You might want to contact the sheriff too. Forgery on property documents is a serious matter." I thanked her, grabbed the papers, and left, my mind buzzing with equal parts fury and anticipation. I called Tony from the parking lot. He listened quietly as I explained what I found. "This woman's crossing into criminal territory," he said finally. "Send me the scanned documents. We'll start by filing an injunction to freeze any HOA actions on that property. Then we go after her for fraud." I sent him everything and spent the next few days gathering more evidence. The HOA newsletters were full of subtle propaganda, phrases like Youth Leadership Initiative and Community-Managed Assets. They made it sound like Margaret was some kind of visionary, grooming her son to lead the next generation. The irony was almost impressive. She wasn't stealing for greed. She was stealing for ego. She wanted her family name immortalized on this lake. Meanwhile, Chase was turning my property into his playground. Every evening I saw him hosting parties, blasting music, and parading around in swim trunks like a minor celebrity. He posted videos online titled "Life at the Lake House," where he posed in front of my dock and captioned it, "Finally moved into my new place." His followers flooded the comments with congratulations. I watched every one of those clips with a mixture of disgust and curiosity, saving them all as digital evidence. But the more I watched, the more I understood his weakness. He wanted fame, not property. He craved attention, not ownership. Margaret might have orchestrated the scheme, but Chase was the performative pawn that could bring the whole operation down if pushed the right way. A week later the HOA meeting was held in the clubhouse. Normally these meetings were dull affairs about lawn maintenance and dues, but this one had the energy of a courtroom drama. I sat in the back, pretending to be calm, while Margaret stood at the podium talking about modernizing community resource allocation. She used words like inclusive, sustainable, and participatory to justify theft. Chase sat in the front row, smirking and nodding like a spoiled king. When she opened the floor for comments, I raised my hand. "I'd like to address the false property reassignment of my lake house," I said, standing up. The room fell silent. Margaret blinked but recovered quickly. "Oh, that matter has already been reviewed," she said with rehearsed composure. "The board voted and the decision was finalized." I took a deep breath and held up a folder. "You mean this board?" I said. "The one that signed this fraudulent form with my forged signature?" Gasps filled the room. Margaret's confident mask cracked for the first time. "I have no idea what you're talking about," she said, but her voice trembled. I walked to the front, placed the copied document on the table, and said, "The county clerk confirmed this was filed under your name. I've also filed a legal injunction. Any further attempt to claim that property will result in criminal charges." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then a man from the board muttered, "Is this true, Margaret?" She stammered something about administrative miscommunication and clerical errors, but it was too late. The whispers started. The board members looked uneasy. Chase stood up, trying to rescue her. "My mom didn't do anything wrong," he snapped. "This is just a misunderstanding. We have the right paperwork." He reached for the folder, but I pulled it back. "Try touching that," I said quietly, "and I'll make sure the police fingerprint it." His face turned red. Margaret finally ended the meeting early, claiming there was hostility in the room. I left smiling. For the first time, I saw fear in her eyes. Over the next week, the neighborhood became divided. Some believed me, others still clung to Margaret's version of the story. She began damage control, sending out emails blaming administrative confusion, while privately telling people I was overreacting. But she underestimated how fast rumors spread when people smell scandal. By midweek, even her allies were questioning her motives. I heard that one of the board members, an older man named Carl, had started looking into her other projects. Apparently my house wasn't the only one she'd meddled with. She'd pressured an elderly couple to sell their boathouse for community use, then handed it to her nephew. The pattern was clear. Margaret's HOA was a personal empire. Tony called with good news. The court had granted the temporary injunction, meaning the HOA couldn't make any legal or financial move involving my property until the matter was resolved. "They're trapped," he said. "Now we start building the civil case." But I wasn't satisfied with just freezing her. I wanted her publicly exposed. I wanted her power dismantled. And for that, I needed to push her son into making a mistake big enough that everyone would see what kind of people they really were. That opportunity came 2 days later. Chase threw another party at the lake house, but this time it got out of hand. Someone posted a video of him bragging about how the HOA gave me this property after kicking out the old guy. The clip went viral among the local community, sparking outrage. Neighbors who had once defended Margaret now demanded answers. I printed screenshots of the video and sent them anonymously to every board member. By the next morning, half of them had resigned. The HOA was unraveling faster than she could glue it together. But Margaret wasn't done yet. That evening she showed up at my door again, this time without her fake smile. Her hair was disheveled, and her voice carried a sharp edge. "You've made a huge mistake," she hissed. "Do you have any idea who you're dealing with?" I leaned against the doorframe and said, "Apparently someone who forges documents." She stepped closer, her voice lowering. "You'll regret this. My son is already moving forward with the legal transfer. The board might have doubts, but we'll win in court." I stared at her for a long moment and then said quietly, "You're not fighting for your son's future. You're fighting to cover your ego." Her jaw tightened and she turned to leave. As she reached her car, I called out, "By the way, the video of your son confessing went public. You might want to check your phone." She froze mid-step, fumbled for her phone, and when she saw the screen light up with notifications, her shoulders slumped. She didn't say another word. She just got in her car and drove off. That night, as I watched the reflection of the moon on the lake, I knew the tide was turning. Margaret's empire was cracking, her credibility fading, and her spoiled son had become the face of her downfall. But something in me wanted more than justice. I wanted finality. I wanted a revenge so sharp it would leave her questioning every decision she'd ever made. That's when Tony's idea became my plan. "If they claim to own your property," he'd said earlier that week, "nothing's stopping you from selling it right out from under them. Legally." I smiled at the thought. They wanted ownership? I'd give them paperwork so real they wouldn't see it coming until the deed was already gone. By the next week, things had taken a bizarre turn that even I hadn't anticipated. Despite the mounting backlash, Chase decided to move into the lake house full-time as if nothing had happened. He showed up in a rented moving truck, blasting music loud enough to make ducks scatter from the shoreline. I stood at a distance watching as he unloaded furniture, beanbags, a massive TV, and even a neon sign that said Chase's Lake Life. He whistled cheerfully the whole time, completely ignoring me like I was an invisible bystander. Margaret hovered nearby giving instructions with her usual air of self-importance, pretending everything was perfectly legitimate. When I asked her why she thought she could move her son into my house after a court injunction, she responded with that smirking confidence only delusion can produce. "Oh, the injunction's under review," she said. "Besides, this is only temporary housing. We're making sure the property is cared for while ownership transitions." I wanted to laugh at how insane that sounded, but I didn't. I just took more photos. Everything was evidence. By sunset, Chase had turned my dock into a bachelor paradise. Loud music, floating beer coolers, and a grill smoking over the water. He even hung a banner across the railing that said, "Grand Opening, Private Residence." I called Tony again and told him what was happening. His response was calm, methodical, and exactly what I needed to hear. "Let him dig his own grave," he said. "Don't confront him. Just keep the evidence coming. Every photo, every video, every transaction. When we file the final motion, the judge will have a field day." It wasn't easy watching someone treat my family home like a frat house, but I knew the more they flaunted their theft, the harder they'd crash. Over the next few days, I became a ghost in my own neighborhood. People who once waved at me now avoided eye contact, unsure whose side to take. Some secretly supported me but feared Margaret's wrath. Others were simply entertained, gossiping about the lake house drama like it was a soap opera. Chase loved the attention. He started inviting locals over for bonfires, giving tours of his new property, and bragging about how his mom was reclaiming what the HOA rightfully owned. He'd stand on my porch holding a drink, talking loudly about expansion plans and renovations that made no sense. Once, I overheard him say he might turn the basement into a recording studio, because this whole lake house influencer vibe is going to blow up. He had no idea that every video he posted was another nail in his legal coffin. But what fascinated me most wasn't his arrogance, it was Margaret's calm persistence. Despite the chaos, she still attended HOA meetings as if nothing had gone wrong. She'd show up in her pastel suits, smile for the group photo, and talk about community leadership. It was as if she believed that by keeping up appearances, she could rewrite the narrative. I started attending the meetings again, quietly sitting at the back, taking notes. I noticed she was avoiding any official mention of my property now. No agenda item, no reference, nothing. She was trying to erase the paper trail before it burned her. But the damage was already done. One afternoon, as I returned from the store, I saw Chase standing outside taking a phone call. His tone was urgent, panicked even. He didn't see me at first, so I stayed behind my truck and listened. "No, Mom," he said, pacing. "The utilities got cut off. They said the bill's not in my name and they can't accept HOA authorization. I told them you're handling it, but they don't care." He paused, listening. Yeah, okay, but hurry. I can't even charge my phone right now. And the Wi-Fi's gone too." I almost laughed out loud. The county had frozen all accounts linked to the property after the injunction, meaning any attempt to assume ownership triggered an alert. They couldn't even pay for electricity without my authorization. It was poetic justice served cold. That night, I saw the glow of flashlights through the windows of the lake house. Chase and his friends were wandering around with phone lights, trying to find candles. One of them yelled, "Dude, how can you live like this?" And another said, "I thought your mom owned this place." I watched from my porch across the water, sipping coffee and feeling a satisfaction I hadn't felt in weeks. The lake was silent except for their frustrated shouts echoing into the night. It was the first time the balance of power shifted. The next morning, Margaret stormed into my driveway before sunrise, slamming her car door and marching toward me. Her perfect hair was undone, and her face carried that brittle smile she used when she was desperate. "You think cutting off the utilities is going to scare us?" she snapped. "You're just making things harder for yourself." I calmly pointed to my property line marker and said, "Everything that happens beyond that point isn't my problem." She glared, her hands trembling slightly. "You'll pay for this in court." I shrugged and replied, "Good. I like receipts." She turned around and left without another word, but I could tell she was starting to break. Meanwhile, Tony's plan was gaining momentum. He had a buyer interested in the property, a real estate developer who'd been looking for lakefront land to build eco-cabins. When I met him, he was professional, sharp, and most importantly, willing to pay cash. Tony explained the legal situation to him in detail, and the developer's response was surprisingly simple. If it's legally yours and the title's clean, I don't care who's squatting there. I'll take it. That single sentence changed everything. For weeks, Margaret had acted like she was untouchable. But once the sale went through, she'd realized just how powerless she truly was. Before we could proceed, though, Tony needed to ensure the title transfer would be airtight. That meant I had to bait Margaret into making one more mistake, something that would prove she knowingly acted in bad faith even after being warned by the court. The opportunity came sooner than expected. A few days later, I received a notice from the HOA demanding I pay maintenance fees for the lake house property. The letter was dated after the injunction and signed by Margaret herself. That single document was the golden ticket. It proved she continued acting as if she owned my property despite a court order forbidding it. Tony was ecstatic when I sent him the photo. "She just handed us everything we need," he said. "Once this sale finalizes, we'll bury her legally." While Tony handled the paperwork, I kept observing from the shadows. Chase's fantasy life was crumbling faster than his Wi-Fi signal. His so-called friends stopped visiting, his videos got flooded with mocking comments, and the HOA supporters started turning their backs. The same neighbors who once whispered behind my back were now gossiping about how Margaret's empire was collapsing. Even the HOA's treasurer, a nervous man named Dale, stopped showing up to meetings after someone leaked an email chain revealing Margaret had pressured him to alter financial reports. The perfect facade was rotting from the inside. Then, one afternoon, the final insult arrived. I came home to find Chase on my dock, pacing in circles, shouting into his phone. He was yelling at Margaret, calling her useless, saying she'd ruined everything. "You said this was mine," he shouted. "You said I'd own it." I didn't want to interrupt, but his next words stopped me cold. "They're saying it's already for sale." "How is it for sale?" "You told me it's ours." My lips curled into a smile. The rumor had reached him. Tony had just listed the property privately for the developer's purchase, and word had started to spread. The panic in his voice was pure music. He hung up, kicked the dock post, and stormed off muttering curses. That night, Margaret showed up again, this time trying to reason instead of threaten. She brought a peace offering, freshly baked muffins, which she placed awkwardly on my porch railing. "Let's not escalate this further," she said softly. "There's been confusion, yes, but we can resolve it amicably. Maybe a joint ownership arrangement." I almost laughed. "You want to co-own the house your son illegally occupied?" She smiled thinly. "Think of it as saving face for both of us." I took one of the muffins, tore it in half, and dropped it on the ground. "You lost face the day you forged my signature," I said. "Now watch what happens when the truth catches up." She tried to speak again, but I closed the door gently in her face. The following morning, Tony called with the news I'd been waiting for. The buyer had officially wired the funds, and the deed transfer was scheduled for the end of the week. Once it finalized, the property would legally belong to the developer, not me, and definitely not Margaret or her son. Chase's imagined empire would vanish overnight. I walked down to the lake and looked at the reflection of the house on the water. The building that had been my family's retreat, the one they'd tried to steal, was about to become the very instrument of their downfall. The irony was perfect. They wanted control, but I would give them consequence instead. And as I stood there listening to the faint sound of Chase arguing again on his phone, I couldn't help but whisper the same promise I'd made that first night when they tried to take it from me. "You think you can own it, but soon, you'll find out what it's like when someone sells it right out from under you." The week the sale was finalized started quietly, too quietly for a neighborhood that had spent the last month drowning in gossip. The lake shimmered under a pale morning sun, ducks skimmed across the surface, and for a fleeting second it almost felt normal again, until I noticed Margaret's SUV parked outside the lake house and Chase pacing across the porch like a man waiting for a miracle that would never come. I stayed on my own porch, pretending to sip coffee, when in reality my phone was recording every move they made. Tony had told me that as soon as the papers were signed, the developer's team would send in their own surveyors to mark the property line for the upcoming demolition. I couldn't wait to see the look on Margaret's face when she realized her son's supposed house now belonged to someone else entirely. By noon I got the message I'd been waiting for. Tony simply texted "done." 2 letters that ended a month of chaos. The lake house was officially sold. It was no longer mine, no longer theirs, and completely beyond Margaret's control. That evening I decided to walk down the lake path, just close enough to hear what they were saying without being noticed. Chase was on the phone, yelling as usual. "I don't care, Mom. They're saying some developer bought it. How could that even happen?" He paused, listening, then shouted again. "What do you mean it's impossible? You told me the paperwork was handled." His voice echoed across the water like a tantrum from an overgrown child. Margaret came storming out of the front door, phone in hand, trying to calm him down but failing miserably. "It's a mistake," she insisted. "There's no way the deed could have changed hands without my approval." Chase stared at her, eyes wide, face red. "Without your approval? It's not even your house." That line hit her like a slap. She froze, realizing what he had just said, and for a moment there was silence except for the distant sound of wind through the trees. Then she turned on him, furious, and shouted something I couldn't make out before storming back inside. Their perfect alliance was finally cracking. The next day the survey team arrived. 3 men in neon vests with measuring equipment began walking around the property, placing stakes and marking lines with bright orange spray paint. Chase ran out barefoot, demanding to know who they were, and one of them simply replied, "We're here on behalf of the new owner." Chase blinked, confused. "New owner? That's me." The man checked his clipboard and said, "Sorry, sir, the deed shows a different name." He handed him a copy of the document. I watched from the trail as Chase scanned the paper, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Margaret came rushing out, snatched the document from his hands, and when she saw the developer's signature and the county seal, her entire posture deflated. For a woman who built her reputation on authority, that moment was pure collapse. She tried calling someone, maybe her lawyer or one of the board members, but the look on her face told me no one was answering. That afternoon she showed up at my house again, but this time there was no pretense left. Her voice cracked as she spoke. "You sold it," she said quietly, almost whispering. I nodded. "Legally, fair and square." She shook her head like she couldn't believe it. "You can't do that. It's under dispute." "The board," I cut her off. "The board has no jurisdiction anymore. The property's private, sold to an external developer. You don't even have standing to contest it now." She stared at me, speechless, eyes darting like she was searching for a loophole in reality. "You destroyed everything," she finally said. "You embarrassed me in front of the entire community." I met her gaze and said, "You did that yourself the moment you forged my signature." She turned away, muttering something under her breath, and walked off slowly like a person who just realized the kingdom they ruled was built on sand. 2 days later the developer's construction crew arrived with trucks, equipment, and a small trailer office. The first thing they did was post large red notices around the lake house that read, "Property under new ownership. All unauthorized occupants must vacate immediately." The irony was delicious. Chase came running out in a panic, waving his phone at the crew leader. "You can't do this. I live here." The man didn't even look up from his clipboard. "Then you might want to start packing, kid. You're trespassing on private property." I stood at the edge of my yard pretending to water plants while recording every second. Chase called his mother, who arrived 10 minutes later in her usual whirlwind of perfume and fury. She started screaming about lawsuits, about corruption, about how the HOA would never allow this. The crew leader calmly handed her a copy of the county records showing the completed transfer. She threw it on the ground like it burned her. I don't think I'd ever seen her look smaller. The following morning the eviction became official. A sheriff's deputy showed up, clipboard in hand, explaining that they had 24 hours to remove all personal belongings before the property would be sealed for renovation. Chase tried to argue, saying his mother was the rightful owner, but the deputy just pointed to the legal paperwork. If you've got an issue, take it up with the court, but right now you're trespassing. The look on Chase's face was priceless. Shock, disbelief, humiliation all tangled together. Margaret stood behind him, silent for once, her hands clenched at her sides. The deputy gave them until the next morning. That night, I watched from my porch as the lights in the lake house burned late into the night. I imagined them frantically packing, arguing, blaming each other. The empire of entitlement was crumbling, one cardboard box at a time. By the next afternoon, the place was empty. The porch furniture was gone, the neon sign was gone, even the banner Chase had hung was gone. Only a few broken decorations remained, scattered across the yard like souvenirs from a failed dream. When the developer's crew arrived to start clearing out debris, I walked down the path and stopped near the dock. The foreman, a grizzled man with a cigarette in his mouth, nodded at me. "You the guy who sold it?" he asked. I smiled. "Yeah." He chuckled. "Heard the backstory. Whole neighborhood's talking. Hell of a move." I shrugged. "They tried to steal it first." He grinned, exhaling smoke. "Then I'd say you gave him a master class in payback." I watched as the first demolition crew began removing planks from the deck. The sound of splintering wood echoed across the water. For the first time in weeks, I felt peace. Of course, peace didn't last long. Margaret wasn't one to disappear quietly. 2 days later, the HOA sent out a community statement accusing me of violating neighborhood ethics and damaging the reputation of the association. The letter was written in her flowery language, full of words like integrity and harmony. But it was too late. Most residents knew the truth by now. Someone had leaked the video of Chase screaming during the eviction, and it spread through the neighborhood group chat like wildfire. By evening, people were making jokes about the Great Lake House scandal. A few even stopped by to congratulate me, saying it was about time someone stood up to her. Margaret's empire had turned into a punchline. That weekend, the developer himself came to inspect the site. We shook hands near the dock and watched the crew mark out where the new cabins would go. He told me he planned to build a set of eco-friendly rental cottages, each with solar panels and private dock. "This place has potential," he said. "Shame it's been wasted on HOA politics." I laughed. "You have no idea." As we talked, I saw Margaret standing across the lake, watching from the road with her arms crossed. Her son was beside her, staring at the construction site like a kid who dropped his ice cream cone. I gave them a small wave, and though she didn't wave back, I saw her shoulders sag. That was the moment she finally understood it was over. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and the water glowed orange, I sat on my porch thinking about everything that had happened. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about balance, about restoring the line between arrogance and accountability. Margaret and Chase had built their identities on control, believing they could manipulate anyone into submission. But the lake had a way of humbling people. Its stillness reflected truth more clearly than any mirror. I watched the demolition lights flicker across the water and thought about my next step. Tony had already suggested filing a civil suit for damages, not just to recover costs but to make sure Margaret's actions were permanently documented in court records. I told him I'd think about it, but deep down I knew I would. People like her didn't stop until you made them. The next morning, the demolition began in earnest. The rumble of machinery echoed through the valley as the excavator's claw tore into the front porch. Margaret showed up again, screaming at the workers to stop, but no one listened. Chase stood behind her, head down, muttering curses. I walked to the property line and simply watched, arms folded, as the house that had caused so much chaos finally came apart piece by piece. It wasn't the kind of revenge that came with fireworks or applause. It was quiet, methodical, final. The sound of collapsing timber was better than any victory speech. Margaret eventually stopped yelling and just stood there, staring as the roof caved in. When she finally turned to leave, she glanced at me for one last time, her face pale and empty. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. The silence said everything. The dust from the demolition had barely settled when the real chaos began. Margaret had always thrived on control, and losing that house publicly shattered the illusion she'd built around herself for years. She spent the next few days spiraling, calling emergency HOA meetings, sending furious emails, and trying to rally the few supporters she had left. But it was like watching a queen without a kingdom. The same people who once feared her now whispered about her behind her back. Some even laughed at how the HOA leader extraordinaire had lost everything to a technicality. I heard from a neighbor that she'd been pacing the clubhouse late into the night, talking to herself, trying to find a way to reverse what had already been sealed in law and signed by the county. The morning after the demolition, she stormed into the county clerk's office demanding to undo the sale, only to be told that the transaction was irreversible. When she realized she had no power left to manipulate, she apparently threw her handbag at the counter and screamed that the system was corrupt. People filmed it, of course. Within hours, the video of her meltdown made its way through local social media groups under the title, HOA Leader Loses It Over Lake House. Meanwhile, her son Chase had vanished from public view for a while, probably hiding from embarrassment. But when he finally showed up again, he was worse than before. The spoiled arrogance was gone, replaced by the bitter pride of a man who couldn't accept his own downfall. One afternoon I saw him standing on the empty lot where the house used to be, staring at the rubble as if expecting it to rebuild itself through sheer entitlement. He turned when he saw me and yelled across the distance, "You think you won, old man? This isn't over." I didn't bother replying. His words had no weight anymore. He was like a shadow pretending to cast light. The irony was that for all his mother's scheming, he'd been the one to ruin everything with his constant bragging and stupidity. His social media fame had turned into public humiliation. The same followers who once admired his fake success were now mocking him with comments like, "Bro, you lost your house to a paperwork wizard." The HOA itself was in shambles. Margaret's grip had been absolute for years, but once people saw that she could be beaten, the entire board turned on her. Carl, the quiet board member who had always nodded along to her every word, was now openly calling for her resignation. Dale, the treasurer she'd once intimidated into falsifying budgets, confessed everything to the community, providing emails that proved she had been redirecting HOA funds to pay for her own home renovations. That revelation hit harder than anything else. What started as a property dispute turned into a scandal that reached every corner of the neighborhood. Residents who'd once tolerated her tyranny now demanded her removal. Someone even spray-painted Queen of Fraud on the HOA clubhouse door. The empire she had built on fear and manipulation had crumbled to dust. But Margaret wasn't the type to go quietly. When all else failed, she tried to file a lawsuit against me, accusing me of defamation and intentional emotional distress. The papers arrived one morning, delivered by a nervous courier who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. I took one look at the ridiculous complaint and called Tony. He read it, sighed, and said, "This is going to be fun." Within 2 weeks we filed a counterclaim, defamation, harassment, and property fraud. The evidence we had was airtight. The forged documents, the court injunction, the fake property transfers, the video of Chase claiming ownership, and even the HOA newsletters, all of it painted a perfect picture of her deceit. The case never made it past the first hearing. The judge dismissed her claim outright and referred our counterclaim to civil court for damages. The look on her face that day in the courthouse was something I'll never forget. She sat there in her signature pastel suit, hair perfectly styled, pretending to be calm while her world imploded around her. News spread quickly. Local media picked up the story, framing it as a cautionary tale about HOA corruption gone too far. Headlines called her the HOA dictator who lost it all. She hated that label. For years, she'd prided herself on being the face of community order, the pillar of neighborhood excellence. Now she was the cautionary meme of every homeowner's nightmare. The irony was delicious. I even caught a few reporters interviewing residents near the lake, asking what they thought about the scandal. One neighbor said, "Honestly, she deserved it. You can't run a neighborhood like a dictatorship and expect people to stay quiet forever." Another laughed and said, "The guy she tried to scam sold her own fantasy out from under her. That's poetic justice right there." Every word of it reached Margaret, and I could tell from the way she avoided eye contact whenever we crossed paths that she was finally broken in a way she'd never admit out loud. Chase, on the other hand, tried to reinvent himself. He started posting videos online about lessons learned and moving forward, pretending to be some kind of motivational influencer. But the internet never forgets. His old clips bragging about owning the lake house were still everywhere, stitched and remixed by users adding captions like Entitlement 101. Every attempt he made to clear his image only made things worse. One video even went viral where he tried to explain that it was all a misunderstanding, but people flooded the comments with laughing emojis and references to me. He eventually deleted his accounts, retreating into silence, just another fallen ego in the digital sea of ridicule. As for me, I focused on moving forward. The developer invited me to visit the construction site one morning. The skeletons of the new cabins were rising, their frames catching the early light. It was strange to stand there and see progress where chaos once reigned. The lake felt peaceful again. The constant tension that had filled the air for months was gone, replaced by the soft hum of saws and the sound of workers talking. The developer walked beside me, explaining how they planned to name each cabin after native trees. "We're calling this one Willow Point," he said, pointing to the spot where my old dock used to be. I smiled and said, "That's fitting. It's where everything bent but didn't break." He didn't understand the deeper meaning, but I did. The lake had been through storms before, and it always found its calm again. That calm didn't extend to Margaret, though. The HOA finally held a vote to remove her from office. The meeting was packed, more people than I'd ever seen in that clubhouse before. She stood at the front, trying to speak, but every word was drowned out by angry voices demanding accountability. When the vote was tallied, it was unanimous. Even her last loyal ally, a woman named Trudy, voted against her. The humiliation was complete. She walked out without a word, and by the next day, her house had a for sale sign in front of it. Rumor had it she was moving to stay with relatives in another state. Chase disappeared with her, though not before getting one last ticket for illegal parking outside the construction site. I wish I could say I felt triumphant, but what I felt was something different, satisfaction mixed with relief. I hadn't just won a feud. I had dismantled an entire system of abuse that had ruled our neighborhood for too long. Tony called to tell me the civil case was still ongoing, and with the evidence we had, it was only a matter of time before she'd owe damages. "You might actually make money off this," he joked. I told him it wasn't about money. It was about principle. He laughed and said, "You know, most people don't win against HOAs. You didn't just beat them, you turned the whole story into a legend." Maybe he was right. Weeks passed, and life slowly returned to normal. The new cabins neared completion, and families began visiting the lake again. The air felt lighter. One evening I sat on the new dock, watching the sunset reflect off the water. It was the same view I'd always loved, only this time it felt earned. I thought about everything: The knock on my door that started it all, the endless arguments, the sleepless nights, and the final satisfying crash of the bulldozer tearing down their fantasy. Margaret had tried to take something that wasn't hers, but in doing so, she gave me something better: peace, clarity, and a story that would live in local memory for years. A week later I received a letter in the mail. It was from Margaret. The handwriting was shaky but unmistakable. She didn't apologize exactly, but she wrote, "I misjudged you. I thought I could win because I always have. But you were right. The lake belongs to those who respect it, not those who claim it." I read it twice, folded it neatly, and placed it in a drawer. For all her flaws, it was the closest thing to an apology she'd ever give. I didn't need revenge anymore. I already had something better: justice. And as the evening breeze rippled across the water, I couldn't help but smile at the quiet irony of it all. The HOA leader who claimed my lake house for her spoiled son ended up losing not just the house, but her crown, her power, and her pride. Months passed, and the lake slowly healed from the chaos that had consumed it. The sound of construction had faded, replaced once again by the rustle of wind through trees and the gentle slap of water against the docks. The developer's project was complete now. 6 modern cabins lined the edge of the shore, each with soft lights that shimmered on the water at night like floating lanterns. The old house was gone, its memory buried under new foundations, but the air carried a different kind of peace, one earned through battle. I would often walk down the path in the evenings, hands in my pockets, feeling the calm that had once been impossible when the HOA's grip had poisoned every inch of this community. The lake was free again, and so was I. But even in peace, echoes of that storm lingered in small, unexpected ways. Some nights I still caught myself glancing across the water, expecting to see Margaret's SUV parked by the dock or hear Chase blasting his ridiculous music, but those ghosts never returned. They'd left, but their legend hadn't. People still talked about it. The Great Lake House War, the HOA downfall, the man who sold the property out from under his enemies. It had become neighborhood folklore, a story that neighbors told newcomers over coffee or during fishing trips, half in disbelief, half in admiration. One morning I was sitting by the water when Tony called. He had a grin in his voice when he said, "Congratulations. The court just awarded you damages from the counterclaim." I didn't say anything at first, just let the weight of his words sink in. After everything that had happened, it felt strange to think there was still more victory left. He continued, "They settled out of court. Margaret's attorney agreed to pay a sum to close the case. It's not huge, but it's enough to make a point." I asked how she had reacted, and Tony chuckled softly. "She didn't. Her lawyer handled everything. Word is, she sold her house last month and moved to another county. Probably hoping to start over." I thanked him, and after we hung up, I just sat there staring at the ripples spreading across the lake. I wasn't angry anymore. The revenge had already done its work long ago. What I felt now was something more complicated, a quiet kind of closure that doesn't come with fireworks, just the realization that everything had come full circle. The following weekend, I got a surprise visit from the developer who'd bought the lake house. He parked his truck near the dock and called out my name. When I walked over, he handed me a small wooden plaque that read, "In gratitude for protecting this place." It was carved with the image of a heron standing in shallow water, wings half open. "Thought you'd appreciate this," he said. "You're part of this place's story now." I thanked him, touched more than I expected to be, and hung the plaque on my porch later that day. It felt symbolic, like the final chapter closing quietly on its own. But closure didn't mean the past was forgotten. A few weeks later, I received a message from one of the new cabin guests. He said he'd found a silver key while walking near the shore, engraved with the initials MH. My first thought was that it belonged to Margaret. Maybe she dropped it during one of her frantic visits when everything was falling apart. I told him to keep it as a souvenir, but he mailed it to me anyway, along with a note that said, "Thought this belonged to the story?" I laughed when I read that. Even strangers knew the tale by now. The silver key sat on my desk after that, a tiny reminder of how close I'd come to losing everything and how poetic it was that the only thing left of her power was a useless piece of metal. Then came the day I least expected, a letter postmarked from out of state. It was from Chase. The handwriting was messy, uneven, and the first line caught me off guard. I don't know why I'm writing this, maybe because my mom told me I should own up to things before it's too late. He went on to describe how everything had fallen apart after they left, how his mother barely spoke to him for weeks, and how he'd realized too late how much damage his arrogance had caused. I thought I could just post videos and live off other people's respect, he wrote. Turns out you can't fake integrity. I learned that the hard way. He ended with something I didn't expect. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. You didn't deserve that. You fought back the right way. I've started working at a marina, trying to actually earn something for once. Maybe someday I'll be back at a lake that isn't haunted by my mistakes. I folded the letter carefully and put it in the same drawer as his mother's. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was humanity, and that was enough. Life after all of it became simple again. The HOA restructured completely. Carl was elected as the new president, and under his leadership the association transformed from a dictatorship into something almost unrecognizable. Meetings were open, rules were reasonable, and people actually smiled at each other instead of whispering complaints. The neighborhood felt alive again, as if Margaret's fall had lifted a curse. Every so often, someone would bring up her name, usually with disbelief that one person had managed to hold so much control for so long. But the moment always ended with laughter or a shake of the head, a sign that her reign was truly over. One evening, about 6 months after everything ended, I took my small fishing boat out onto the lake. The air was cool, the water calm, and the cabins glowed softly behind me. I rowed to the middle and let the boat drift. As the sky turned from gold to deep blue, I thought about how this whole mess had started. A knock on the door, a forged letter, a spoiled boy claiming what wasn't his. And now, sitting there surrounded by the same water that had witnessed it all, it felt almost unreal. People always think revenge feels like fire, but in truth, it feels like silence afterward. It's the quiet satisfaction of knowing you didn't just win, you endured. You outlasted the chaos, and now the world is peaceful again because of it. I must have sat there for an hour, watching stars appear one by one, when a noise made me look toward the far end of the lake. A small motorboat was sputtering near the its engine coughing like it was on its last breath. At first, I thought it was just a tourist, but as I squinted through the dim light, I saw the driver struggling with the controls. The engine gave one final sputter and then died, leaving the boat adrift. The person waved frantically and shouted, but the sound didn't carry far. I rowed a little closer until I recognized the face. It was Chase. For a moment I thought I was seeing a ghost. He looked thinner, older somehow, with the awkward look of a man trying to rebuild a life that had fallen apart. His motorboat drifted helplessly, and I could hear him muttering curses under his breath. Part of me wanted to row closer and help, but another part of me couldn't resist the irony. The son who once thought he owned the lake was now stranded on it. Eventually, a ranger from the other side noticed and came to tow him in. I watched quietly, unseen, then turned my boat toward home. The lake had delivered its final lesson on its own. When I reached the dock, the moon was high and silver across the water. The air smelled of pine and peace. I tied the boat, walked up to my porch, and sat in the old chair that had been there long before any of this began. I looked out over the lake one last time that night, thinking about how everything that had gone wrong had somehow led to something right. The HOA was fair now, the neighborhood was thriving, and even the people who once followed Margaret's lead were more humble. She had tried to own everything, my house, the lake, even the narrative itself, but in the end the story belonged to me, to the truth, and to the place that refused to be controlled. As I sat there, A faint breeze rippled the water and carried the sound of laughter from the cabins across the shore. Families were gathering around campfires, kids were splashing near the docks, and the world felt alive again. For the first time, I didn't feel anger or victory, just gratitude. The lake had tested me, pushed me to my limits, but it had also taught me patience, cunning, and the art of quiet justice. I leaned back in the chair, closed my eyes, and listened to the soft rhythm of the waves against the shore. The war was long over, but the peace it left behind was deeper than I ever expected. And as the night deepened, I smiled to myself at the final twist that no one but me would ever fully understand. The HOA leader who claimed my lake house for her spoiled son had lost it all, but I had gained something far greater. The lake didn't belong to either of us. It never had. It belonged only to itself, and somehow that made all the difference.